The wind howled across the endless plains, carrying the stench of deceit and desperation. Charlotte Bennet, her heart still raw from her husband's tragic death, clutched her 2 children as her in-laws abandoned them in the middle of nowhere. Just days earlier, she'd believed nothing could be worse than widowhood, but betrayal had come swiftly laced with greed and cold calculation. Her little ones whimpered in the punishing cold, their clothes torn by the fierce prairie gusts. Panic seized Charlotte's chest. Suddenly, upon a distant rise, a lone Cheyenne scout appeared silent as a ghost. Her fate and that of her children teetered between life and death. Charlotte Bennet had always been told she possessed an unbreakable spirit. Raised along the Missouri River, she dreamed of forging a new life in the West. Her marriage to James Bennet, a wagon train scout, brought that dream to life as they journeyed to the Colorado Territory in 1864. Along the way, Charlotte gave birth to 2 children, sharp-witted 6-year-old Elizabeth and wide-eyed 4-year-old Daniel, and they eventually settled near the South Platte River. But after James died in a tragic riding accident, Charlotte's world fell apart. Struggling to maintain the homestead alone, she accepted help from James's uncle and aunt Theodore and Eugenia Bennet, who arrived from the east with promises of support. Within weeks, they convinced her to travel to a supposedly better patch of land near Fort Laramie. Instead, they led her deep into a remote and unfamiliar stretch of plains. One night, Charlotte was jolted awake, gagged and restrained, as Theodore and Eugenia tore her children from their bedrolls. They confessed their plan: forge a deed in Charlotte's name, claim the land, and sell it to settle Theodore's gambling debts. They left Charlotte and the children with no food, no supplies, and no hope, abandoned in the vast wilderness under a cold prairie sky. Morning light brought a dusty, colorless dawn, bathing the lifeless prairie in shades of brown and gray. Charlotte's throbbing head reminded her that the nightmare was all too real. She looked into Elizabeth's fearful eyes and Daniel's tear-streaked cheeks. No water, no food, no map. Theodore and Eugenia had taken everything. Charlotte forced herself to remain calm. The survival of her children depended on it. She knew a few frontier skills from her time traveling with James. She scanned the horizon for landmarks. Far in the distance, the undulating outline of sandstone bluffs pointed westward. If she recalled James's lessons correctly, the South Platte River might be found somewhere beyond those bluffs. Gathering what little strength she had, Charlotte set her mind to walking. She tore strips from her petticoat to bind her children's blistered feet. Elizabeth and Daniel, though frightened, obeyed their mother without complaint. They trudged across dry grass and exposed rock under the punishing glare of the sun. The day stretched endlessly, and with each passing hour, dehydration tightened its grip. By evening, the children could hardly stand. A dust storm loomed on the horizon, those violent, swirling winds that could choke travelers and bury entire wagons under dunes of shifting soil. Charlotte scrambled to find shelter, but there was none to be found in the open plain. She hastily bundled the children against her skirts, using her own body as a shield. The storm engulfed them, stinging their faces with sand and grit, turning their lungs raw. Darkness fell early, and Charlotte felt her resolve slipping beneath mounting exhaustion. Sometime during that terrible night, Daniel coughed uncontrollably. Elizabeth clung to her mother's arm. Fearing her children might die before daybreak, Charlotte prayed silently. She prayed for James to guide her. She prayed for a miracle. She prayed for anything. Only the howl of the wind answered. When dawn broke, the dust storm had retreated, leaving half-buried footprints and an eerie silence in its wake. With minimal shelter from the elements and no sign of rescue, Charlotte steeled her resolve. They would continue west, toward any slope of rising land that might hint at water or a settlement. She tried to recall any mention of local tribes from her husband. The Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota roamed these regions, but whether they would offer mercy or hostility, she could not guess. The second day of walking was even harsher. The sun beat down mercilessly, burning exposed skin. Elizabeth's lips cracked, Daniel's face reddened, and Charlotte felt her body threatening to collapse. Still, she pressed on, urging her children to keep hope alive. By midday, faint shapes appeared on a distant ridge. Figures on horseback, moving in a formation that suggested skilled riders. Charlotte's heart fluttered in panic and faint hope. Were they cavalry from a nearby fort? Perhaps Fort Laramie? Or were they tribal warriors? She ushered the children behind a scrubby bush and watched nervously. Dust rose around the figures, distorting them. She could not tell if they had seen her. Desperation tempted her to wave them down, but fear of hostility held her hand. Ultimately, the riders turned east, disappearing over the horizon, never noticing the small family huddled in the brush. That night, Charlotte and her children found a shallow ravine to rest in. The air was cooler there, though the dryness of her throat made every breath painful. She closed her eyes, imagining James's face. Tears rolled down her cheeks, silent tears of sorrow, fear and anger at those who had done this to them. She did not know how, but she vowed she would survive. She would see to it that her children survived, even if she had to crawl across the desert to find help. On the third day of desperate wandering, something changed. Elizabeth collapsed. First, her small legs too weak to continue. Charlotte gathered her daughter in her arms, using the last scrap of energy she possessed to carry the child. Daniel trailed closely, his head drooping. Charlotte's mouth was so parched, she couldn't produce enough spit to swallow. She thought she might have hallucinated when a lone figure appeared on the horizon. A man on horseback. He wore buckskin leggings and carried a bow slung across his back. He had long black hair, parted into 2 braids. His features were unmistakably indigenous, a Cheyenne, perhaps by the style of his clothing. Charlotte froze, uncertain what to do. The man dismounted. He approached slowly, cautiously. She could see the tension in his stance, wariness born from too many violent encounters with white settlers. Yet there was no malice in his eyes. He lifted a water skin and held it out. Charlotte could only stare, half delirious. Was this a trick? She had heard stories, some true, some exaggerated, of raids and scalpings. But then hadn't James also spoken of great kindness among tribal people? She reached for the water skin, her trembling hands nearly dropping it. The stranger said nothing at first, but the kindness in his gesture spoke volumes. He motioned for her to drink, and she did, sputtering as water poured down her throat. She handed it to Elizabeth and Daniel, who gulped greedily. After they had drunk their fill, Charlotte found her voice. "Thank you," she rasped. "Thank you, sir." In halting English, the man introduced himself as Elk Shoulder. He was a Cheyenne scout, traveling alone across the plains to rendezvous with his band, who were camped closer to the Black Hills. His name meant he carried the strength of elk upon his shoulders, a symbolic weight of responsibility. He pointed to Charlotte and the children, then to the distant hills. "Need help?" he asked, his accent thick. Charlotte nodded, tears welling up once again. We were left. My in-laws. They took our wagon, our supplies." She could barely articulate the betrayal and heartbreak, though he understood only fragments of her speech. Elk Shoulder's sympathetic gaze spoke enough. He recognized abandonment and cruelty when he saw it. With silent efficiency, Elk Shoulder helped Charlotte lift her children onto his horse. Then he guided them on foot, leading the animal at a gentle pace so that no one would be jostled too hard. They walked for hours, stopping often to let the children rest. At dusk, Elk Shoulder made camp near a dry creek bed. He kindled a small fire, cooking strips of dried buffalo meat over the flames, occasionally adding water from his precious supply to create a simple broth. The children devoured it hungrily, hope flickering in their eyes for the first time since the ordeal began. That night, under a canopy of stars, Charlotte found that her heart no longer felt like a lead weight in her chest. Desperation was still there, but so was gratitude. She tried to speak to Elk Shoulder, piecing together words. She explained James's death, her in-laws' betrayal, and how they ended up lost in the middle of nowhere. Elk Shoulder listened intently, his brow furrowed in empathy. He understood enough to nod solemnly. Then he wrapped a buffalo hide around the children to keep them warm, and gestured for Charlotte to sleep. The last thing she saw before exhaustion claimed her was Elk Shoulder, standing guard, his dark silhouette outlined by moonlight. When dawn painted the sky pink and gold, Elk Shoulder guided them toward a path that skirted rolling hills and shallow valleys. He told Charlotte in broken English that water and shelter could be found near a place the Cheyenne called Mo'otavehone, which translated roughly to River of the People, likely referring to a tributary that connected to the South Platte. Charlotte guessed they were heading west, but her sense of direction remained muddled. Still, relief came at the sound of running water. They reached a small stream fed by snowmelt from distant mountains. Charlotte and the children drank greedily, washing the grit of the plains from their faces. Elk Shoulder caught fish using a makeshift spear, demonstrating a survival skill that left Charlotte awed. He offered the family every comfort he could spare. Over the next few days, Elk Shoulder revealed fragments of his own story. He had lost much during the westward expansion of settlers, as had many Cheyenne. Lands once freely roamed by his people were overrun by wagon trains and soldiers from Fort Laramie and Fort Lyon. He had witnessed entire villages decimated by broken treaties, real recorded treaties like the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie, which promised tribal territories but was soon disregarded. Yet he harbored no immediate hatred toward Charlotte and her children. He recognized in her eyes a suffering not unlike that of his own people. Together, they navigated the wild prairie. Elk Shoulder studied tracks and the direction of the wind, moving with care to avoid any potential trouble, be it roaming war parties or unscrupulous white scouts. Occasionally they spotted bison herds in the distance, a reassuring sign that nature's balance was momentarily intact. Each evening they made a small fire, cooking what little they had, while Charlotte tried to teach him words in English, and he taught her a few Cheyenne phrases. For Charlotte, this time was surreal. She had grown up hearing cautionary tales about indigenous warriors attacking settlers. Yet here she was, surviving only thanks to a lone Cheyenne scout's generosity. She worried about what might happen when they reached a settlement. Would Elk Shoulder be turned away, or worse, persecuted for simply existing? She wrestled with these moral quandaries as the days passed, all the while watching her children grow stronger. Their cheeks regained color, and their eyes sparkled whenever Elk Shoulder showed them something new. A bird call, a medicinal plant, the quiet grace of nature's rhythms. But trouble was never far away. On the 5th day since Elk Shoulder rescued them, a sudden column of dust rose in the south. A group of riders' American cavalry, by the glint of metal, cut across the plains. Elk Shoulder hastily ushered Charlotte and the children behind a large outcrop of rock, urging them to stay silent. The riders thundered past, oblivious to the family's hiding place. Charlotte realized how precarious Elk Shoulder's position was. If discovered, he risked being seen as an enemy Indian, and if the cavalry recognized her, they might assume Elk Shoulder had captured her. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of red, Charlotte asked Elk Shoulder if he could lead them to Fort Laramie. She thought it the safest option, a place with medical supplies and perhaps an official who could help her reclaim her stolen property. Elk Shoulder agreed, but his eyes flickered with unease. He had never been fond of military forts, and for good reason. Still he nodded. His sense of honor demanded he see Charlotte and her children to safety. Thus, with the final destination in mind, their journey began to take more definite shape. They marched over ridges and through shallow gorges, picking up game trails that meandered northeast. The weather began to shift with cooler nights, hinting at the approach of autumn. Once they reached Fort Laramie, Charlotte intended to plead for help. A single question gnawed at her. Would anyone believe her story about Theodore and Eugenia's treachery? Early one morning, the group woke to the sound of distant gunfire echoing across the plains. Startled, they broke camp. Soon came quickly. Elk Shoulder scouted ahead, crouching low as he surveyed the terrain. Charlotte's heart pounded with dread, recalling stories of ambushes or warring factions. When Elk Shoulder returned, he motioned for them to follow quietly. They crept along a ridge until they could see a shallow valley below. There, a group of men in dusty coats, likely buffalo hunters, were engaged in a standoff with a party of Lakota warriors. Corpses of slaughtered buffalo lay scattered around, a sight that struck Charlotte as both horrifying and wasteful. Elk Shoulder tensed, his fist clenched around his bow. The Lakota had every right to be enraged. Wanton buffalo hunting threatened their way of life, as the herds they depended upon for food and shelter were being annihilated. Smoke rose from the muzzle of a hunter's rifle, and the echo of another shot rang through the air. The Lakota responded with arrows, forcing the hunters to retreat behind the carcasses. Shouts in Lakota reverberated over the screams of wounded men. Charlotte shielded her children's eyes, her stomach churning. Realizing that this skirmish could escalate rapidly, Elk Shoulder led Charlotte and the children around the valley, keeping to higher ground. They moved slowly and silently, but the acrid smell of gunpowder clung to the air for miles. Charlotte's hands shook as she tried to calm Elizabeth and Daniel, who whimpered at the terrifying sounds of violence. Never had Charlotte felt the tension between the white settlers and the indigenous tribes so keenly. They traveled well into the night to put distance between themselves and the valley. Finally, they set up a small hidden camp among rock formations. The children fell asleep almost instantly, drained by the day's ordeal. Charlotte sat near the dying embers of the fire, eyes wide with lingering fear. Elk Shoulder approached, his expression grave. "Much danger," he said in halting English, pointing back toward the conflict. "People," he paused, searching for words. "Fight for land, for buffalo, for honor. Very bad. Many will die." Charlotte nodded sadly. "Why is it always bloodshed?" she whispered, thinking of how easy it was for her in-laws to cast her and her children aside. Greed, desperation, pride, it all boiled down to power. She felt a sudden kinship with Elk Shoulder, an understanding that they were both caught between unstoppable forces. She laid a hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said again, voice trembling with gratitude. His eyes reflected the firelight as he nodded. "I help your children. They have good hearts." In the hush of the night, Charlotte found her resolve hardening. She would not allow her children to be lost in this world of violence and betrayal. She needed to get to Fort Laramie to find a way to secure her rights to the land that James had fought so hard to claim. And in whatever way possible, she would repay Elk Shoulder's kindness. 3 more days passed. Food became scarce, and Elk Shoulder had to hunt tirelessly to keep them fed. He left before dawn, returning at midday with a hare or a few grouse. Charlotte tried to forage for berries and roots, relying on memories of what James had taught her. Elizabeth and Daniel followed Elk Shoulder around like puppies, enamored with his skill at tracking animals and reading the signs of the sky. During one such hunt, Elk Shoulder returned with a grim face. He had spotted smoke trails that indicated a cavalry patrol was nearby, possibly from Fort Laramie. He wanted to avoid them at all costs until they drew closer to the fort, where there would be some semblance of order. A random patrol on the open plains might shoot first and ask questions later if they saw a Cheyenne man with a white woman and children. That afternoon, as they traversed a rocky plateau, a small group of men on horseback emerged suddenly. They wore battered hats and carried rifles. Charlotte's blood ran cold. These were not soldiers, but they looked armed and dangerous. One was a bearded man with harsh eyes that flickered with greed when he saw Elk Shoulder's horse. Another had a limp, but his posture suggested he was no stranger to violence. "Whoa there!" the bearded man called out, raising a hand. "What do we have here? A squaw man leading a lady and her young'uns." Charlotte felt Elk Shoulder tense. He subtly maneuvered himself between the men and the children. She could sense the danger crackling in the air. The men eyed Elk Shoulder's buckskin clothing, then turned to Charlotte. "You in trouble, ma'am?" the bearded man asked, voice laced with false concern. "We can help you get rid of that savage." Fear coiled in Charlotte's belly, but she lifted her chin. "He's my guide," she said firmly. "We're on our way to Fort Laramie." "Oh, is that so?" The limping man spat a wad of tobacco. "That's a good piece of horseflesh he's got. Maybe we'll lighten your burden. Save you from the Indian." Elk Shoulder's hand inched toward his bow. He said nothing, but his eyes blazed. Charlotte sensed a confrontation brewing. She held up her arms protectively. "Stay back," she warned, though her voice wavered. "We want no trouble." The men shared a grin that reeked of malice. "Trouble's already here," the bearded one sneered. Suddenly, the limping man raised his rifle. A shot rang out, but Elk Shoulder was quicker. He dove, dragging Charlotte and the children to the ground. The bullet whizzed overhead, echoing across the plateau. Another shot followed. This time, Elk Shoulder notched an arrow and fired with lightning speed, grazing the limping man's shoulder. The man yelled in pain. "Run!" Elk Shoulder shouted to Charlotte, pointing to a cluster of rocks for cover. Elizabeth and Daniel cried out as Charlotte shoved them forward. She dared a glance back, heart hammering in her chest. Elk Shoulder faced the men alone, loosing another arrow that struck the bearded man's horse. The wounded animal reared, throwing its rider to the ground. Elk Shoulder wasted no time. He leapt onto his own horse, guiding it toward Charlotte and the children. Together they fled, bullets whistling past them. One shot clipped the flank of Elk Shoulder's horse, causing it to stagger. Despite the animal's pain, Elk Shoulder maneuvered it skillfully, galloping across the plateau until the men were a distant blur behind them. Only then did he slow dismounting to tend the horse's wound. Charlotte's heart did not stop pounding until nightfall. She realized with a chill how close they had come to tragedy. If Elk Shoulder had not been with them, she and her children would have been at the mercy of outlaws. Wordlessly, she helped him wash and bind the horse's wound. Exhausted and shaken, they made camp in a hidden ravine, all too aware that danger lurked everywhere on the lawless frontier. When they finally neared Fort Laramie, Charlotte's nerves were frayed. The fort was a bustling hub on the Oregon Trail, where wagon trains, traders, and soldiers converged. She had never been there herself, but James had mentioned its high wooden walls and the row of barracks that housed soldiers. It was also a place where native tribes came to trade or negotiate treaties, though those negotiations were often fraught with tension and betrayal. As they approached, Elk Shoulder grew quieter. He knew that once they passed through the gates, his life would be in the hands of people who might see him as an enemy. Charlotte sensed his apprehension. "I'll speak for you," she assured him softly. "I won't let them hurt you." Elk Shoulder simply nodded, but she could see the doubt flicker in his eyes. He was well aware of how easily white men's promises could be broken. The fort's walls came into view at dusk. Lanterns flickered near the entrance, and a pair of soldiers stood guard. When they saw Elk Shoulder, they stiffened, rifles raised. Charlotte stepped forward quickly, hands in the air. "Please, I need to speak with your commanding officer," she called out. One guard peered down at her from beneath the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, is this Indian holding you against your will?" he demanded, finger on the trigger. Charlotte's voice rang firm. "He is my guide. We seek assistance." She gestured to her children. "We've been traveling for days. My children are exhausted. Let us in." After a tense moment, the guards lowered their rifles. "All right," said the first guard. "But the Indian's got to stay outside. We'll let the commanding officer decide what to do with him." Charlotte's heart sank. She turned to Elk Shoulder, whose face remained impassive. "I won't abandon you," she insisted, her voice trembling. "I promise." Reluctantly, Elk Shoulder stayed behind, guarded by 2 rifle-wielding soldiers. Another soldier led Charlotte and the children through the fort's wooden gates into a courtyard filled with wagons, crates of supplies, and uniformed men bustling about. A tall officer with a bushy mustache approached his polished boots, clicking on the dusty ground. He introduced himself as Captain Everett Harrison. Charlotte recounted her story, her husband's death, her in-laws' betrayal, and how they had survived thanks to Elk Shoulder's intervention. She begged for medical attention for the children and for the horse, explaining how they had been attacked by bandits. Captain Harrison listened with a reserved expression, occasionally jotting notes in a small ledger. When she finished, Harrison nodded slowly. "I'm sorry for your troubles, Mrs. Bennett," he said. "We'll see to your children's immediate needs, and you'll have safe lodging here at the fort while we straighten this out." His gaze shifted. "But as for the Indian, we don't typically allow—" "He's the reason we're alive," Charlotte interjected. "He's done nothing wrong. He saved us. Please, I beg you, treat him with respect." Harrison pursed his lips. "I'll see that he's given no trouble, ma'am," he replied somewhat stiffly. "But we can't just let him wander around the fort. We'll keep him under guard for everyone's safety until we learn more." Charlotte wanted to protest further, but the weight of exhaustion pressed on her. She nodded, willing to make small compromises if it meant Elk Shoulder would not be harmed. Captain Harrison signaled a corporal to escort her and the children to the infirmary. As she walked away, she glanced over her shoulder. Through the open gates, she glimpsed Elk Shoulder standing stoically surrounded by soldiers. Their eyes met, and she mouthed, "Thank you." He nodded once, a silent exchange that spoke of trust, albeit a fragile one. That night, Charlotte and the children slept on cots in the fort's modest infirmary. A tired medic treated Elizabeth's blistered feet, and examined Daniel's cough. Charlotte herself was patched up, her cuts cleaned and bandaged. Despite the austere conditions, it felt like the height of luxury compared to the open plains. The following morning, Charlotte requested a meeting with Captain Harrison to discuss how she might file charges against her in-laws. She wanted them held accountable for theft and attempted murder. Harrison agreed to see her, but he seemed cautious. He explained that the fort's jurisdiction was limited, and they would need more evidence or testimony before taking any legal action. Nonetheless, he promised to send word to other forts and outposts along the Oregon Trail to be on the lookout for Theodore and Eugenia Bennett. While Captain Harrison was kind, Charlotte couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Soldiers eyed her curiously, likely gossiping about her tale of betrayal and rescue by a Cheyenne scout. She noticed a certain tension in the air, especially regarding Elk Shoulder's presence. The frontier was ablaze with conflicts between the U.S. Army and various plains tribes. Any single spark could ignite an inferno. When she insisted on seeing Elk Shoulder, Harrison relented. He escorted her to a guarded corner of the courtyard, where Elk Shoulder sat on a bench, bound at the wrists, though not severely more a precaution than cruel imprisonment. Relief washed over Charlotte when she saw that he appeared unharmed. She knelt beside Elk Shoulder. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted you to be treated like this." He gave a half smile, shrugging as best he could. "Fort?" "Soldier ways," he said in broken English, his tone resigned. "I am okay." Harrison cleared his throat. "Ma'am, you'll need to remain within the fort until we figure out the best course of action. We can't simply release the man either, not with tensions running high. And there's the matter of verifying your story. We don't doubt you, but official procedures must be followed." "Of course," Charlotte said quietly, not wanting to antagonize the only semblance of law in this wild land. But a flicker of anger lit inside her anger at how easily rules and regulations could overshadow basic gratitude. If Elk Shoulder hadn't saved her, they wouldn't be having this conversation at all. Days turned into a week. Charlotte found herself in a strange limbo. She and the children had food and relative safety, but no resolution. Captain Harrison continued to gather information. He questioned Charlotte repeatedly, as well as Elk Shoulder, through an interpreter, a half-French, half-Cheyenne trader who happened to be at the fort. The interpreter, named Laurent Dupont, treated Elk Shoulder with respect, but there was clear tension between him and the U.S. Army officers. In the midst of this, rumors swirled. A cavalry unit was preparing to move out, rumored to be joining a larger campaign against various tribal encampments suspected of raiding settlers. Elk Shoulder grew more restless, worried about being trapped in the fort as hostilities escalated. Charlotte felt caught between gratitude toward the army for sheltering her children and fury over the injustice done to Elk Shoulder. One afternoon, Captain Harrison approached Charlotte with new information. A traveling peddler had reported seeing a man and woman matching Theodore and Eugenia's descriptions. They were heading east, possibly to Cheyenne City, later called Cheyenne, Wyoming. The fort had dispatched a message to authorities there, but it might take weeks or months for any real action to be taken. "That's not good enough," Charlotte said, slamming her hand on a wooden table. "They tried to kill us. If they aren't stopped, they'll sell the land or do something worse." Her cheeks flushed with anger. Harrison sighed. "I understand your frustration, Mrs. Bennett, but the Army's resources are limited. Our primary concern is maintaining stability and protecting wagon trains. We'll do what we can, but I can't promise a full manhunt for your relatives." Despair weighed on Charlotte. She left the captain's office feeling the helplessness of a pawn on a chessboard. In the courtyard, she found Elk Shoulder in the same corner, still under guard. She walked up, noticing the guard was a younger soldier, who seemed more empathetic than the others. She asked if she could speak to Elk Shoulder privately, and surprisingly, the guard allowed it, stepping away a few paces. She lowered her voice. "I'm stuck," she told Elk Shoulder. "They won't help me find Theodore and Eugenia, and they won't let me just leave. I have to do something." Elk Shoulder nodded, eyes keen. "We go. You want find them, we go." He flexed his bound wrists. "Need freedom." Charlotte's heart pounded at the implication. If she helped Elk Shoulder escape, she'd be considered a traitor to the fort's authority. But if she stayed, she might never reclaim her life, never see justice for James's memory. She remembered James's final words before his accident, telling her to always follow her conscience. In that moment, her mind was made up. "Give me time," she whispered, her gaze flicking to the guard. "I'll find a way to get you out. Then we'll go after Theodore and Eugenia ourselves, or at least we'll get away from here." Elk Shoulder's expression was resolute. "Aho," he said, a Cheyenne word of agreement. With a final nod, Charlotte stood. She offered a small, hopeful smile, then turned away. The next phase of her life was set. She would rescue the man who had rescued her, even if it meant betraying the very fort that had given her children sanctuary. That evening, a thunderstorm rolled in. The sky crackled with lightning rain drumming on the fort's rooftops. Charlotte seized the opportunity. Soldiers scurried about, latching doors and windows, securing supplies from the downpour. Visibility was poor. The guard shifts grew chaotic. She had observed the rotation for days. She knew exactly when Elk Shoulder's post would have the fewest men watching. Using a small file she had borrowed from the blacksmith's workshop, Charlotte slipped into the courtyard under the cover of darkness. She wore her cloak hood pulled up against the sheets of rain. Elizabeth and Daniel were sound asleep in the infirmary, under the care of a kind nurse. Charlotte planned to return for them once Elk Shoulder was free. She felt a pang of guilt at leaving them, but she needed them safe for now. She found Elk Shoulder's guard huddled beneath a leaky awning, cursing the weather. Elk Shoulder sat nearby, drenched wrists bound to a post, but with enough slack to move slightly. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the yard. Charlotte's heart thundered with excitement and fear. Carefully, she signaled to Elk Shoulder. In the storm's cacophony, the guard didn't hear her approach from behind. With trembling hands, Charlotte pressed a cloth soaked in a strong herbal concoction to the guard's mouth. It was something the infirmary medic used for sedation during painful procedures. The guard tried to struggle, but exhaustion and surprise worked to Charlotte's advantage. After a few moments, he sagged unconscious. Charlotte lowered him gently. Quickly, she used the file to saw through Elk Shoulder's wet bindings. The rope parted, and Elk Shoulder stood massaging his wrists. He nodded his thanks, a determined set to his jaw. Lightning flickered again, revealing other guards across the courtyard. They had not yet noticed the situation. Silently, they ducked between wagons and supply crates, making their way toward the fort's main gates. In the gloom, a stable door sat ajar. Elk Shoulder pointed. They crept inside, finding a startled young stablehand trying to calm the horses spooked by thunder. The stablehand froze upon seeing them. Before he could cry out, Elk Shoulder raised a cautioning finger to his lips, then opened a stall, retrieving the horse that had carried them this far. It whinnied softly at the sight of him. Charlotte felt her pulse racing. At any moment, a guard could discover them. They led the horse outside, hugging the fort's perimeter. The main gate was locked. However near the back of the enclosure was a small sally port used by patrols. With the wind and rain raging, no one stood guard there. They slipped through, breath catching in their throats, as they emerged onto the open plains. Only once they were a few hundred yards from the fort did Charlotte release the breath she'd been holding. The taste of freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. "We have to go back for my children," she gasped, turning to Elk's shoulder. "They're still inside." He hesitated, glancing at the fort's towering walls. "Very dangerous," he said quietly. "Soldiers search soon." Lightning illuminated Charlotte's grim expression. "I won't leave them behind," she insisted, voice wavering. "I can't." Elk's shoulder looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. They agreed to hide until the storm died down. Then Charlotte would attempt to re-enter the fort, retrieve Elizabeth and Daniel, and slip away. It was a near-suicidal plan, but no other options presented themselves. They found shelter in a small gully, using a rock overhang to protect against the rain. For the second time in her life, Charlotte felt the weight of near-impossible odds pressing down on her. Yet she had something she didn't have before: a purpose fueled by righteous anger and maternal love, combined with the debt of honor she owed to Elk's shoulder. As the storm ebbed, they prepared for the risk that lay ahead. Charlotte refused to let her children remain at the mercy of a system that viewed Elk's shoulder with suspicion and might never truly believe her story. With the first glimmers of dawn, they'd act. In the hazy pre-dawn light, Charlotte made her move. She walked brazenly up to the fort's gate from the outside, telling a startled guard that she had gone for a brief walk to calm her nerves during the storm. She offered a shaky story about feeling claustrophobic in the infirmary and stepping out while the gates were momentarily unguarded. The guard eyed her suspiciously, but the chaos of the previous night's storm seemed to lend some credibility. He let her in, scolding her for endangering herself. Charlotte rushed to the infirmary to find Elizabeth and Daniel. They woke with bleary eyes, confused but relieved to see their mother. "We're leaving," she whispered urgently. "There's not much time." Despite their questions, the children obediently followed her. She led them through the labyrinthine passages, heading for the sally port. The soldiers were still on high alert after discovering Elk's shoulder's escape, but they didn't suspect Charlotte would also flee. She kept her head down, guiding the children behind stacked crates. Just as they neared the gate, a soldier recognized her. "Mrs. Bennet," he called. "Wait. The captain wants to talk to you about the Indians' escape." Charlotte froze. Elizabeth and Daniel pressed themselves against her skirts, trembling. Summoning her courage, she turned and forced a calm smile. "Yes, I'm on my way to see him," she lied. "Just needed some fresh air with the children." The soldier frowned, but before he could question further, a commotion erupted on the opposite side of the courtyard. Shouts of "He's over there!" rang out. Charlotte seized the chance. She grabbed the children's hands and sprinted towards the sally port. Once through, she ducked behind tall grass, the children panting. Elk's shoulder emerged from the nearby gully horse in tow. Elizabeth's face lit up. "Elk's shoulder," she cried. He gave a genuine smile at the sight of them, then hurried them to mount the horse. It would be a tight fit, but they had no choice. Shots rang out from the fort walls. The soldiers must have spotted them. "Hold on," Elk's shoulder shouted. The horse took off, galloping across the plains with thunderous strides. Charlotte clung to the children, her mind racing. She wondered if the fort would send a pursuit party. Almost certainly yes, but for now, they had a head start. They pushed the horse to its limits, traveling until the fort was a speck on the horizon. They finally slowed by a rocky creek, panting and drenched in sweat. The children were pale eyes, wide with a mix of terror and excitement. Charlotte dismounted shakily. "We did it," she said, hardly believing the words. "We're free." For the first time since James's death, she felt something akin to hope coursing through her veins. Yes, the army might be after them, and she still had no proof to bring her in-laws to justice. But she had her children, and she had Elk Shoulder, her unlikely savior and ally. Together they would figure out the next step far from the oppressive walls of Fort Laramie. Charlotte and Elk Shoulder agreed they couldn't simply wander the plains forever. They needed to track Theodore and Eugenia, who were rumored to be heading toward Cheyenne City. If Charlotte could confront them there, or at least alert local authorities, perhaps she could salvage her deed and have them arrested for attempted murder. With that plan in mind, they turned their horse south toward the old trails that led to the booming railroad towns. Over the next few days, they avoided major roads, wary of encountering cavalry patrols. Elizabeth and Daniel adapted surprisingly well, forging a bond with Elk Shoulder that transcended language. They giggled when he showed them how to mimic bird calls or pointed out trails of small prairie animals. In quiet moments, Charlotte would reflect on how different life had become since James's death. She was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a frontier mother, determined to protect her family at any cost. Their first stop was a small settlement near the Nebraska-Wyoming border. Charlotte asked around, discreetly describing Theodore and Eugenia to local shopkeepers and a saloon bartender. She learned that a couple fitting their description had indeed passed through, boasting of new land they intended to sell near the South Platte. The bartender recalled that the couple seemed nervous, like they were running from something. Encouraged by this lead, Charlotte resumed their journey southward. They encountered a few wagon trains heading west, but mostly kept to themselves. Every so often they traded Elk Shoulder's skill in hunting for supplies. He'd provide fresh game in exchange for flour, sugar, and coffee. This arrangement was precarious, as some settlers recoiled at the sight of a Cheyenne man, but Charlotte's fierce protectiveness and quick words eased tensions enough to avoid conflict. As the landscape shifted from rolling plains to the gradual rise of distant hills, Charlotte's anticipation grew. Cheyenne City was a growing rail hub, attracting all sorts: entrepreneurs, prospectors, gamblers, and lawmen. If Theodore and Eugenia planned to sell a stolen deed, that was likely where they'd attempt to do it. But the city would also be crawling with dangerous elements, not to mention U.S. Marshals and Pinkerton agents. She had to move carefully, poking around for criminals who had tried to kill her would put her at risk. One evening they camped by a shallow creek. The children fell asleep, lulled by the soft chirping of crickets. Charlotte and Elk Shoulder sat beside the dying embers of a campfire. The moonlight illuminated Elk Shoulder's thoughtful expression. "You do not stay in fort. You choose me and children," he said quietly, as if still surprised she'd gone through with her plan. Charlotte studied the fire's glow. "You saved our lives. I couldn't let them treat you like a prisoner. It was wrong, and I knew it. Besides, I can't let my in-laws get away with what they did. That fort wouldn't help me. But you did." His dark eyes reflected the flickering embers. "You are strong, Charlotte. Strong heart." She felt her cheeks warm. No one had called her strong since James died. Everyone had seen her as a fragile widow. Yet Elk Shoulder recognized a resilience she hadn't fully seen in herself. She murmured her thanks, a knot of gratitude and admiration tightening in her chest. Though they came from vastly different worlds, both had known betrayal and suffering. Now they shared a single purpose: to find justice. Cheyenne City was a far cry from the tranquil plains. Steam locomotives chugged into the station, belching black smoke. Merchants hawked wares from rickety stands. Saloons and gambling halls lined the main street, their signs promising everything from fine whiskey to fortunes made at the turn of a card. The law existed here, but it was shaky enforced by a small police force and the occasional federal marshal passing through. Charlotte Elk. Shoulder and the children arrived in late afternoon dust coating their clothes. She instructed the children to stay close and keep their heads down. Their first order of business was to find a safe place to sleep. They located a modest boarding house run by a widowed woman named Mrs. Petrie, who gave them a wary once-over, but relented when Charlotte paid in advance. Once the children were settled, Charlotte ventured out with Elk Shoulder, scanning the crowded streets for any sign of her in-laws. She visited a small land office, feigning interest in purchasing property. While there, she asked casually if anyone had recently come in to sell a homestead near the South Platte. The clerk, a bespectacled man with ink-stained fingers, frowned. As a matter of fact, I did have a couple in here the other day, asking about land deeds. He admitted, flipping through a ledger. Their names were Bennett Theodore and Eugenia. Claimed to have a rightful deed for a place near the river. They seemed a bit off, if you ask me. Charlotte's heart hammered. Did they sell it? The clerk shook his head. Not yet. They were trying to confirm its validity. Said they'd be back once they got everything in order. Her throat went dry. Do you know where they're staying? Probably one of the nicer hotels on Main Street. If I had to guess, the clerk said with a shrug. They were dressed fancy enough. Charlotte offered a tight smile, thanked him, and left with Elk Shoulder. The possibility that Theodore and Eugenia were still in town both excited and terrified her. This was it, the moment she'd been fighting for. But confronting them carried massive risk. They might have armed henchmen or they could flee again. Elk Shoulder sensed her tension. We find them, yes, he asked. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. We find them and make them confess, she said, determination etched into every syllable. They spent the rest of the day discreetly asking around at hotels. Most clerks were tight-lipped, but luck favored them at the Grand Cheyenne Hotel. The desk attendant recognized Theodore and Eugenia's description. Yes, they're in Suite 4, he said, his expression souring. That couple's been causing quite a fuss, demanding special treatment. Charlotte felt a surge of adrenaline. She thanked the man, stepping away to confer with Elk Shoulder. A direct confrontation in a busy hotel could cause chaos. But Theodore and Eugenia might slip away if they got wind of her presence. She needed a plan. They decided to wait until nightfall. The clerk hinted that Theodore and Eugenia often dined late in the hotel's restaurant. Charlotte could slip into their sweet search for proof of the forged deed and confront them. Elk Shoulder would stand guard to prevent their escape. At dusk, Charlotte returned to the boarding house to fetch her children. She couldn't risk leaving them alone if things turned violent. She explained the plan in hushed tones. Elizabeth, though scared, seemed resolute. Daniel clung to Charlotte, but she soothed him with reassuring words. Once they were ready, they set out to the Grand Cheyenne Hotel under the cover of darkness. True to the clerk's word, the restaurant bustled with late-night diners. Charlotte spotted Theodore and Eugenia at a corner table decked in finery. Eugenia's jewels sparkled under the gaslight chandeliers, and Theodore laughed loudly, drawing attention from other patrons. Charlotte felt a wave of revulsion. How dare they live lavishly, enjoying prime rib and champagne after abandoning her and the children to die elk? Shoulder watch them, she whispered. Keep them from leaving. I'm going upstairs. With Elizabeth and Daniel in tow, Charlotte slipped past the front desk. The children remained in the hallway, outside Suite 4. As she picked the lock, an illicit skill she'd gleaned from an old traveling companion on the wagon train. The door opened with a soft click. Inside, an oil lamp flickered on a small table. The suite was opulent with a plush carpet and gilded wallpaper. Charlotte's heart pounded as she rummaged through drawers and suitcases. A wave of satisfaction coursed through her when she found a leather pouch containing land documents, papers with her forged signature clearly stating the transfer of ownership from Charlotte Bennett to Theodore Bennett. "Got you," she murmured, carefully rolling the documents and tucking them into her satchel. She would show these to the local law as proof. A triumphant grin tugged at her lips. Suddenly the door flew open. Eugenia stood there, mouth agape. Behind her, Theodore. Their expressions morphed from shock to fury. "You," Eugenia hissed. "What are you doing here?" Charlotte stood firm, adrenaline surging. "Taking back what you stole," she spat. "You left us to die in the middle of nowhere. These papers are forged. You're finished." Theodore snarled, lunging forward. Elizabeth and Daniel screamed from the hallway. Charlotte tried to dodge, but Theodore was bigger and stronger. He pinned her arms, grappling for the satchel. She bit his hand, causing him to yell in pain. Eugenia, eyes wild, grabbed a porcelain vase, ready to strike Charlotte. Before she could swing, Elk Shoulder materialized behind her, wrenching the vase from her grasp. Eugenia shrieked, stumbling. "How dare you!" she shrilled, stumbling over a small table and crashing to the floor. In an instant, Elk Shoulder had pinned her arms, a fierce scowl on his face. Charlotte managed to jerk free from Theodore's grip. She scrambled to the doorway, shielding the children. Theodore advanced, fist raised, but a swift punch from Elk Shoulder sent him reeling into a side table, shattering the lamp. The room plunged into darkness and chaos. Smoke curled from the broken lamp's oil, threatening to ignite the carpet. Shouts echoed from downstairs. Hotel patrons and staff rushed toward the commotion. Charlotte gagged on the acrid smoke, frantic to protect her children. Yet in the flickering glow of the spilled oil, she saw Theodore and Eugenia cower, realizing they were outmatched. A stout man with a shiny badge, the local sheriff, burst into the suite, followed by several townsfolk. "What in the Sam Hill is going on here?" the sheriff roared. He eyed Elk Shoulder with immediate suspicion, but Charlotte wasted no time. "These people," she shouted, pointing at Theodore and Eugenia. "They tried to kill me and my children. They forged the deed to my property. I have the proof in my satchel." Theodore held his bleeding nose, sputtering. "She's lying!" he bellowed, though the trembling in his voice betrayed him. The sheriff glared at Theodore, then turned to Charlotte. "Show me the documents." Her hands shook, but she retrieved the forged papers. The sheriff and a few bystanders examined them under the corridor's lamp. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eugenia, still pinned under Elk Shoulder's grip, screeched about conspiracies. But the proof was undeniable. The signatures and notary stamps were all faked. Chaos reigned for several tense minutes. Finally, the sheriff snapped. "That's enough. I'm taking these two into custody until a judge sorts this out." He nodded to a deputy who clamped handcuffs on a sputtering Theodore and Eugenia. Breathless Charlotte turned to Elk Shoulder, who released Eugenia and stepped back. The crowd eyed him warily. A few men even reached for their holsters. Charlotte shielded him with her body. "He protected us," she said, voice strong. "He's my friend and my children's savior. Don't any of you dare treat him like a criminal." The sheriff raised a hand. "Settle down," he said. "Nobody's going to shoot him. Not while I'm here." Relief flooded Charlotte's veins. Theodore and Eugenia were led away in disgrace, vowing they would get even. The sheriff gave Charlotte a curt nod, motioning for her to follow to the station so she could formalize charges and statements. In that bizarre, adrenaline-fueled moment, Charlotte realized she had reclaimed her life. The path ahead would not be easy: lawsuits, potential retribution from her in-laws, the uncertain place of Elk Shoulder in a society that didn't fully accept him. But she was no longer a victim of betrayal. She stood tall with her children at her side, forging a new destiny from the ashes of heartbreak. When dawn broke over Cheyenne City, Charlotte emerged from the sheriff's office holding valid proof of her rightful land deed. Theodore and Eugenia faced charges that would likely keep them out of her life forever. More importantly, she had reclaimed her dignity and the safety of her children. By her side was Elk Shoulder, the lone Cheyenne scout whose bravery and kindness had been instrumental in her survival. Though the future promised further challenges, prejudices to confront a homestead, to rebuild hope and courage, now burned brightly in Charlotte's heart. Friends, if you found yourself on the edge of your seat, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps bring untold stories of the frontier to life, reminding us that hope and humanity can flourish in even the harshest landscapes. Join us on the next journey into the Wild West, and don't miss the epic tales yet to come.